Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
Welcome to Mortification of Spin. My name's Carl Trueman. I'm a professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College in beautiful Western Pennsylvania. And I'm here with my friend Todd Pruitt, pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Good to be with you again, Todd.
Carl, it's always a pleasure to see you. I am so encouraged by the fact that after all of these years of knowing you, you feel comfortable enough to look slovenly on one of our appointments to record. I don't see a button. I don't see a collar. I see nothing that would suggest pressing or ironing or anything like that.
It's a t-shirt. There is a rumor among students of Grove City College that I do own some t-shirts, but they have ties dyed on the front of them. You can actually confirm this has no tie dyed on the front.
There's no tie on it. However, I would be remiss if I did not mention the fact that there is nevertheless, though it is a t-shirt, it does have a rather pretentious pedigree, shall we say, right? I mean, there's something about Princeton, which is some small college in New Jersey, I heard. It was given to me by
Professor Robert George at Princeton as part of the James Madison program.
Very good, very good.
We had Chad Van Dixhorn staying with us last night, and I did actually have to clarify to Chad this morning at breakfast that I had got dressed. And this was not pajamas. I was intending to be like this for the rest of the day. So,
well, that's good. Yeah. I'm glad you're comfortable. You're clearly comfortable, but
I am comfortable in my own skin.
In contrast to our guest, I might say.
Our guest has shocked me. Our guest today, he's actually part of a very elite group, the Grove City Professor Class of 2018. 3 of us in my own department, Biblical and Religious Studies, came in 2018. Myself, Reverend Dr. Don Shepson, and my good friend who's here today, Duffy Robbins. Duffy is a professor of Christian ministries at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania, has the office next to mine. I see him regularly. He is dressed in a dress shirt and a bow tie. I have no idea what's going on below the belt line, but I'm sure it involves shorts or jeans or something. I can't believe the ensemble is all there. But Duffy, wonderful privilege to have you on the show today.
It's an honor to be here. I spent the afternoon looking for a tie and finally found one in my closet.
It's very
with our wedding stuff. And then to see you in a t-shirt anyway, that's a little disappointing, but Todd, you look respectful and businesslike and professional. Thank you.
Well, I feel immediately at home in Duffy's image here. He has this very tasteful bow tie on, and I say at ease at home because he looks, I mean, like you could be the poster child for the Presbyterian Church in America General Assembly uniform. I mean, you look as Southern Presbyterian. You look as Southern Presbyterian right now as anybody I know.
Definitely a Southern vibe going on.
Well, that's good because I'm from North Carolina. I'm very comfortable with a Southern vibe.
Well, we got Duffy on today to talk about something that he's devoted his entire life to, and has indeed become one of the most influential and well-respected figures concerning I think, evangelicalism in the United States of America, and that is the history, purpose, and the future of youth ministry. So, Duffy, just to kick off with a real softball, could you give us the sort of 30,000-foot view of where does youth ministry come from, and how do you assess the current state of youth ministry in what we call the broad conservative evangelical world at the moment?
Well, of course, it depends on how far you want to trace it back. But if you think about modern youth ministry, as most people know it today, probably most people would trace its roots to Youth for Christ, the 50s. That's really, I think, probably the main genesis of what we see when we look at youth ministry today. Of course, there have been youth ministry movements prior to that, but I think that sort of ethos gave birth to what we see today, which was an attempt, in a sense, to really address, market, do outreach for teenagers. Of course, you have, with the baby boom, you had this huge wave of adolescents breaking across North America, and so it was only reasonable that churches would say, "Hey, what can we do to?" And parents could say, "What can we do to partially out of fear to make sure these kids, aren't probably in the 50s, they're not hoods, or whatever, driving around in hot rods." And so just those kind of concerns, and then the church going, what can we do to harness the potential of these young people? So I think that's kind of where it started. Where it is today, in some ways, I'm always a little bit boring on that, because what strikes me, Todd and Carl, is having been involved in youth ministry. I graduated from seminary in '76, and I was doing youth ministry prior to that. Really became a Christian my freshman year of college, which was in '69, and that's when I really started doing youth ministry. I worked with Young Life as a volunteer, and it seems to me, as I look back, that a lot of the basics have not changed much in terms of the kind of big picture 30,000 foot view, which is that there seems to be a heart for outreach and evangelism, and that certainly could be traced back to the Billy Grahams and the YFC Youth for Christ emphasis. I think there's still certainly a thread. I wish it were more of a rope, but there's certainly a thread of emphasis on scripture and Bible study or Christian education. That can certainly be traced back. There has been, I think, especially since the late 50s, an emphasis not just on meetings, but on relationships. You won't talk with a youth worker very long, probably most youth workers, without hearing them talk about incarnational ministry or relational ministry. That's certainly a thread that goes back pretty far. And I would guess, I'd say those are sort of the big threads that I see, the continuity that I see overall. Maybe I'll stop there and see if you want to pursue anything further on that.
Well, I joined a church staff for the very first time when I was 19 years old. I became a youth intern at my home church in Houston. I was raised in Southern Baptist megachurch culture, big youth ministry. And so immediately I started getting my hands on, youth specialties materials. Mm-hmm. And I saw your name early on, and this was in the late 1980s. And I loved that. I was going to be a lifer in youth ministry. I wasn't going to be a sellout and go be a pastor. I was going to be one of these guys, stayed in youth ministry forever. And then, yeah. And it was great. And by the time I left youth ministry when I was in my early 30s, I on the one hand, I was doing youth ministry better than I'd ever done before, which is hopefully the case because you grow up and mature. Right. But I was also worn out. I mean, I was exhausted. And so much of it had to do with just the way we did youth ministry in the 80s and 90s, particularly in megachurch culture. Mm-hmm. And, at that time I was doing 12 out of town trips a year, camp, super summer, youth VBS. I inherited youth VBS of all things. Good grief.
Be Now weekend.
Yeah. Oh yeah. All of that stuff. Junior high retreat, senior high retreat, Disciple Now weekend, on and on it went. Right. And and so there was kind of, I think, this sad irony that I was a better youth pastor than I'd ever been, and I was utterly exhausted and just couldn't do it anymore. What do you know, now the pace of youth ministry, I think, has changed since then. We're not, I mean, you still have mega churches that are doing, stuff,
Right.
over the top kind of thing. But my sense, and I wonder if you're finding this, is that the level of pressure has gone down, or am I misguided on that?
That's a good question, Todd. I think, just to go back a little bit, I do think a lot of the people like me who met Christ through ministries like Campus Crusade, Young Life, YFC, perhaps, maybe InterVarsity, although that was at least in the South where I grew up, a little bit later in coming than Crusade, and then of course the Navigators, which was also in play, but in a much smaller scale.
Yeah.
A lot of people like me, we became Christians as teenagers, and I think realized this was so strategic for the church and so strategic in our lives that we really felt a call to do this, as you say, long term.
Yeah.
And at that time, that was really, as you say, kind of countercultural, certainly to the professional clergy. I mean,
Right.
I remember being at one church that I served, and we were burning our mortgage, and so the bishop came to celebrate what we had done together. We hadn't seen him prior to that, but we were going to celebrate what we had done together that day. And anyway, I introduced myself to him up on the platform and told him I was a youth pastor. He said, "Oh, okay, so you're not really a minister then." And that was pretty much the way people in youth ministry were viewed by clergy and also by the congregations at large. And I think part of that was just social or demographic. I mean, most people were guys like you who were under, and guys like me who were under 35 or 30. I've seen studies that at the time it said if you were a youth pastor, you probably were in your first full-time position, you were probably under the age of 30, and it was very likely that you were in some sort of internship. So the congregations just typically, based on the research, sort of saw you as somebody who was learning.
Right.
And when you learned, you were going to move on.
Yeah.
And so that was not only reflected in terms of professional respect, but it was also reflected in terms of pay. And I say all that to say that I do think that most youth workers have kind of learned that you can't go 27 hours a day.
Right.
And also I think congregations have realized these people, we need to pay them better.
Right.
And so I think that's obviously it's not a lucrative profession, but I do think youth workers are better paid. And so I think that also helps. It also helps people stay longer.
Right.
And as you observed, as you grow older, number one, you kind of realize I can do this one thing and I don't have to do two other things if I do it well.
Right.
So you just learn to manage yourself better. You also, by necessity, if you're going to be a decent wife or a decent husband, you have to pace yourself better than when you're 23 and single and you could stay out till 2 every night because there's nobody to go home to.
Right.
And so just factors like that, I think, have changed a little bit. Although I think most youth pastors still feel, if you were to ask them, they would say, yeah, we're still under a good bit of pressure. But I say to youth workers, part of it too is, I think when you and I started out, we sort of bolstered one another's sense of calling by saying, look, do what God calls you to do, even if it's youth ministry. And that's why we heard that language a lot, like I'm a lifer.
Yeah.
Because we were all within the guild kind of trying to reinforce one another's sense of calling.
Right.
My concern is that I think we almost overplayed that hand. And now I think I do. There's definitely, I remember at one time the median age of youth ministry in this country, according to research by Group Magazine, was like 35 years old. Now that's the median. So there were
Wow.
quite a few older people there, but I'm sure now it's older than that. And I'm encouraged by that. But I
Yeah.
also think that sometimes people stay in it longer than they should because they're
Yeah.
afraid of selling out to the guild.
Right.
They're afraid of some selling out on some promise they made to you or to me. And ultimately, we didn't invite youth ministry into our hearts. We invited Jesus into our hearts, and I think keeping that central is what really helps with the fatigue and the pace and the passion over all the
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
What do you see as the priorities of youth ministry today, Duffy, and have they changed over the years?
I would say that they probably changed a little bit, Carl. I'm not totally happy about what I think those changes are. There's there's a big concern, maybe I should say an over concern for quote unquote relevance. And I think the problem with that is that you find, I was talking to a group of youth workers about a month ago and said, to me, when I hear some youth workers talking, it reminds me of people who are on the beach and they've just witnessed their first high tide. And all of a sudden they're panicking and we got to move everything. We got to move the church. We got to look, we're going to get, swept away. And I say, I've been on this beach a while and I've seen tides come and go. And if you are moving the church every time, we're not going to have a good foundation.
Yeah.
Plus, it's exhausting. If you sort of chart your course on the river of ministry by stuff that's floating on the top of it, you're going to be constantly dodging and swirling and everything else. And so I really want to encourage youth workers to chart their course by the deeper contours that shape the culture, that shape the theological contours that shape ministry. So my concern, Carl, is that we've kind of focused too much on what's floating on the surface of the water. And of course, if you're in a kayak, you have to be concerned about what's on you can't ignore that. But ultimately, you realize that's not really what's shaping the current and the flow of this river. That's just stuff I need to be aware of. And so that's I think, a real strong emphasis. There's definitely an emphasis, I think, on what, well, I don't know if it's an emphasis intentionally. It's not intentional, but I do think there's what Tom Bergler, he's an historian. He teaches at Huntington College out in Indiana. He'd be an interesting guy for you guys to talk with at some point, but he's written 2 books that you may know. One's called The Juvenalization of American Christianity, and the other is called From Faith to Maturity. And I really appreciate Tom's analysis. He was with Youth for Christ himself, and he saw the benefit of that intentional effort to say, hey, let's really try to make sure our ministries and our messages and our programming are really suited to young people, that we're not expecting young people to act like adults, and somehow if they do, then maybe they can come to church.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I think Tom's concern, and he really articulates this well, is that the problem is we sort of bred in our young people an appetite for juvenalized Christianity. And so when they get into, big church, adult church, they still want to have juvenilized worship services. Mm-hmm. And again, it's sort of like you were talking about earlier, Todd. I mean, that's hard for the youth worker too, because it's exhausting. Right. You can't be 25 all of your life. Mm-hmm. And when I talk to youth workers about staying long-term in a calling where you're surrounded by adolescents, I said, you have to be willing to be you. You'll never get too old to be you. But if you're constantly trying to, be a juvenile and act juvenile and sort of, play that game, not only are we going to breed, as Tom Bergler puts it, juvenalized Christians who really have an appetite for the sensational, for the milk and not the meat, but we ourselves are going to be exhausted. I think it's a misnomer anyway. I don't think that's what's required. I mean, I often say to adults that teenagers do not need adults who act like teenagers.
Right.
They need adults who don't freak out when teenagers act like teenagers.
Right.
Which separates a youth worker from 98% of the adult population.
Yeah.
You know, most adults like teenagers just fine as long as they're not acting like teenagers.
Right.
But you know, that's the wonder of the gospel. That God embraces us where we are.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. That's one of the things I always tell guys that are thinking about youth ministry is, well, you have to really like teenagers for one thing. Like if teenagers annoy you, you're going to be a bad youth minister. But the other thing is, don't you act like a teenager, because that'll freak them out. They'll think you're weird. Now, maybe some of the kids will think it's great if their young youth pastor acts like a horse's rear end. But most of the teenagers I know are just fine if an adult is an adult, so long as that adult is okay if they, the teenager, are still a teenager. And there's something of an art to that. I mean, not everybody's suited to hang out with teenagers. Not every adult
Absolutely.
is suited. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But some are great. I mean, we have people in their 50s and 60s in my church that are so good with teenagers, and that the teenagers respond to so well. We've got at least 2 men in our church, laymen in our church, that John, our youth pastor, has brought in to do some teaching for our youth. Both of these men are in their 60s, and the youth love them. And it's not because these 2 men in their 60s are cool. It's just that those 2 men in their 60s are comfortable with teenagers.
Yeah.
And the kids respond to them so well.
Well, there is a certain coolness to just being comfortable in your own skin, you know.
True. Yeah.
Which frankly, kids hardly ever see people like that.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I think, I know when I stand up and speak at a youth event, they're not looking. I mean, they're going, he is what we were afraid might happen if we came to this thing. They're not thinking, oh boy, this is going to be good. Now I have to then own the responsibility. If I want them to listen, if I want them to pay attention, I have to own responsibility to do what I can to make it engaging, to make it interesting, to speak to where they are in their lives. And of course, trusting that no matter how well I do any of that, without the Spirit of God, it's going to be bankrupt. But I can't just kind of stand in front of them and go, hey, young people, I'm an adult. Duh, you should be respectful of me.
Yeah.
Maybe at one time, that you could have flown that, but I mean, in our culture today, there's not much respect for, you're elder, and so you're older than me, I really need to key in,
Yeah.
Now it's question everything.
Of course.
Hey, I respect you, Duffy.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have
as a young person, Carl, I'm glad I've got your attention.
How do you see you mentioned the juvenilization of American
That crazy word to
Christianity.
say, yeah.
How do youth pastors manage that? Okay, we're dealing particularly with the youth, but we want them to be part of, for want of a better term, grown-up church. We want them to be part of a transgenerational church which does adult things and takes truth seriously, as adults should take it seriously. What is there anything you recommend for the way that youth pastors should think about that particular issue?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'll just say that another plug for Tom is that his book, From Faith to Maturity, that's what that book is about, because everybody read the first book and go, well, yeah, but how do I do that? And so in a much more thorough and, a much more comprehensive way, Bergler tries to answer that question. But I mean, in terms of broad strokes, it's a few things. One is make sure that, your youth ministry does not practice apartheid with old people or older people that don't have as Todd just said, sometimes people who are in their 50s and 60s can be amazing leaders with young people. Don't think you've got to have just a young person,
Right.
I love the joke about the guy 55-year-old guy came to youth group, told his kids he pulled an all-nighter. He told him he slept through the whole night without going to the bathroom. And I mean, I think kids, that's the first thing is they've got to be comfortable. We got to be comfortable saying, hey, this is not, it does not have to be, just juvenile hour down here.
Right. But
secondly, I think also, probably the way we do music, and I don't mean by that necessarily, I do believe that the music for 70, 80-year-old people don't like the same music that teenagers like. And I don't think we should, in the interest of cross-generational or intergenerational ministry, say, well, you're going to have to start liking it because we need to play their music around you. But likewise, I don't think I necessarily want to say to a middle school kid, you have to like the same music style or whatever of meeting the ambiance that your grandparents do. Mm-hmm. We don't do that in school. We don't ask our senior ministry to try to somehow be something that's palatable to 13-year-olds. Mm-hmm. That flattens developmental realities that we know exist, that we know are real. But having said that, I do think that there's definitely some validity in terms of thinking about the hymn that we use, the songs that we use, maybe even liturgies that we use, or just using liturgy at all. Certainly, I see some youth workers, and I think this is a great idea. It's maybe ideal that young people are sitting with their family in church, but maybe a step in the right direction is saying, well, I'm going to be in the sanctuary. I'm going to be at the service. Let's sit together. At least they're in the service and they're learning the rituals and the patterns of worship in a larger, multi-generational congregation. So I think that's it. I like the sort of general emphasis that Mark DeVries, you may remember his name, Todd. He wrote a book back in the early 90s about parent-centered, I think it was parent-centered youth ministry or something like that, DEVRIES, and that has a lot of good ideas, but basically saying that you don't have to do everything you do as a youth group with parents and cross-generational, because again, we don't ask the nursery to do that. We don't ask third graders. We don't do that in school because that just flattens out, bleaches out all the differences we know are there. But what a great way to build into your ministry that kind of intergenerational communication. If you do, maybe out of 3 events or 5 events, how can we do an event that's parent and kid, parent and child? What can we do to do more family camp type stuff? What could we do maybe to have a panel of parents come in and speak on an issue or be a part of a study or something like that? I also use, kind of like you were talking about, Todd, I did just adults in our congregation. Every 8 weeks, we would start a 4-week kind of a elective series. And then I brought in adults, and it was a great thing because our students got to meet other adults in the congregation, and the adults in the congregation got to meet the young people and realize they weren't barbarians. Mm-hmm. So those are the kinds of things, practically speaking, Carl, that I think can help engender that sort of cross-generational communion.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, as someone who was a youth minister for a while and loved it and treasure those memories, and now as a pastor who has the benefit of pastoring a church where we have a really gifted youth pastor, I can tell you, I believe in youth ministry more than I ever have, and a lot of that has to do with me being a senior pastor of a church and watching the benefit of having a really good youth pastor, a man who's an actual adult, has kids of his own, he's mature, he's got great formal training, and so he's able to teach the Bible with expertise, but also with a real sensitivity towards teenagers. And I just encourage you folks out there, churches, if you're able at all to have somebody in your church who can lead, bring leadership to ministry focused, discipleship focused on your teenagers, please do that. And I say that as someone who's a transplant into the PCA. I come out of a culture where youth ministry is just a given and where you pour tons of resources into a youth ministry. And, sometimes Reformed Church doesn't have that same history, and I understand, but I just want to make a plea as a PCA pastor. PCA churches, do what you can to find and nurture a really good youth pastor, because I've seen the benefit of it. It's a model that works great in a Reformed church. You can do it, and you can honor all of your Reformed distinctives and still have an active, engaged youth ministry. And so do that. Well, I want to thank our guest, Duffy. Now, I remember Duffy Robbins back when I was a new, young youth minister. He was one of those guys that I was getting resources from, along with Youth Specialties and that whole crew that really came out strong in the 70s and early 80s. And every guy who was in youth ministry back in those days had, we were listening to all of you same guys. And Duffy is one of those guys who's still now in this stage training youth ministers at Grove City. And wouldn't you all like to just know what it's like in the hallway of the offices where Truman and Robbins have their offices next to each other? There's something about, it would be worth driving out to Grove City just secretly, just to sit out there and see how much doesn't get done.
Carl, is a real prankster too. He's always just practical jokes.
Oh, I bet he is. Yeah,
we did try to steal the 6-foot cutout that Duffy has of himself.
I wondered who was behind that.
We were thinking of taking pictures of it at various points on campus. Where is Duffy's cutout today? What kind of a man has a 6-foot cutout of himself? That is an ego.
A man who's been in youth ministry forever.
Exactly.
Well, again, thanks to our guest, Duffy Robbins. Duffy, thanks for risking your reputation by coming on with us, first of all. Really happy about that. And if y'all will go to our website, mortificationofspin.org, you can register to win a copy of one of Duffy's books. It's entitled Building a Youth Ministry That Builds Disciples. And we would encourage you to get that, register for that. And while you're there at our website, the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals is donor supported, and we'd love for you to consider a gift to the Alliance. Well, we're so glad that you have been with us. Again, thank you to our guest, Duffy Robbins, and for his years of not just youth ministry, but training youth ministers. May his tribe increase in those endeavors, and we look forward to being with you all next time.
There's gotta be more to life than this. There's gotta be more to everything I thought exists.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.